I'm Amanda Knox, and you're listening to Hard Knocks. In this episode of Old School, we revisit my conversation with my friend Jason Baldwin, one of the West Memphis Three. In this episode, he tells his story of going through wrongful conviction in West Memphis, Arkansas, how he and his co-defendants, Damian Eccles and Jesse Mills-Kelly, were absolutely targeted as being suspects in the murders of young boys simply because they wore black trench coats and listened to heavy metal music. It's really amazing story of overcoming an injustice. And I think the thing that always stays with me is remembering how young Jason was when this happened. He was 16 and he spent the next 18 years in prison. So this talks about his journey of overcoming that traumatic thing, as well as the work that he's been able to invest himself in since getting out.
Last episode, we spoke with Ana Vazquez of the San Antonio Four about her harrowing wrongful conviction. She and 3 other women were accused of child molestation during the satanic panic of the 80s and 90s, a social hysteria that swept up hundreds of innocent people, and often people who stood out as different. Ana and her friends were lesbians in Texas.
Jason Baldwin, who you just heard, also stood out as different in his small town of West Memphis, Arkansas. He and his friend Damian Eccles listened to Metallica, and they wore black. And Damian was interested in Wicca and pagan religion. That was enough to bring the lens of suspicion on them when the dead bodies of 3 missing 8-year-old boys turned up in a ditch in May of 1993. And when their friend Jesse Mills-Kelly was coerced into confessing, the fate of these 3 teen boys was sealed.
Despite a lack of physical evidence linking them to the crime, the West Memphis Three, as they became known, were all convicted of murdering the 3 boys in what prosecutors argued was a satanic ritual. Jason, who was 16 at his arrest, was sentenced to life, along with Jesse. Their friend Damian got the death penalty. Today, we're speaking with Jason Baldwin.
Speaking about what I've gone through and my experience, that's part of my healing process, and I welcome it, especially if I believe that the audience is receptive and believe that, someone out there is going to learn a lesson from it. And maybe it's a future law person that's writing laws, a lawyer, whether they're for the state or defense, and it may enable them to look at what they're doing in their work a little bit differently to help prevent something similar from happening to someone else. I don't hide from my experiences. I draw upon them as a strength. And I do talk about it a lot, usually when I'm invited to do talks and interviews and things. Those are the topics of discussion. But, like anyone, when you're asked to talk about your life, you're asked to talk about your life's experiences. And these, as you and I both share, are similar life's experiences. So that's what we draw upon. We can't just close off that section of our life, because that's closing off a part of ourselves and the wisdom and lessons we learned during those times. In that situation, when you're victimized, you can carry yourself with grace, or you can become something worse than what they make you out to be due to anguish and grief and not being able to heal and deal with it in a healthy manner.
Jason has had a lot of time to reflect on his experience and gain insights from it. But to tell Jason's story properly, we have to explain what it was like growing up in West Memphis, Arkansas in the 80s and 90s.
I actually moved to Arkansas on the last day of school for 5th grade. I was living in Memphis, Tennessee, and I came home from school thinking gonna have the whole summer with my friends, to swim and play in the trails and ride bikes. Got off the bus and there's a U-Haul truck there. My grandparents are there, and we're moving to Arkansas while my stepdad's at work. So he's coming home to an empty house. Me and my brother was like, whoa, we didn't know we were moving. My mom's like, if I'd have told y'all would have told him, and he wouldn't have allowed it to happen. So that was astute on her part. But it didn't afford my brothers and I an opportunity to say goodbye to our friends, in the neighborhood and at school, because we all just thought we would be playing with them all summer. But we're kids. We were resilient, and we moved to Arkansas, Lakeshore Trailer Park. My grandmother gave us one of her rent trailers to live in rent-free, which was very nice. I had an obligation to be the groundskeeper for her other rent trailers, so I would push the lawnmower and mow grass. But my brothers and I, we made friends fast with the kids in the trailer park. My mom was like, "Hey, y'all want to go swimming at the VFW swimming pool?" And it's in West Memphis. And because everybody, male in my family pretty much served our country, in foreign wars, we had a membership to, VFW, Veterans of Foreign Wars. And so we could go to and swim in the swimming pool free as part of our membership as our family. And we could also bring guests. There were these kids just down the street from us. And so my mom loaded us all in the car and she took us to the swimming pool, but we could not get in. The people were so hateful. They were throwing pickles at us. They were calling us racial slurs, calling our friends ends, calling us end lovers, and we couldn't get in the pool.
Wow.
My mom took us home, and when we got home, my grandmother comes skidding up in the yard. They had called her and recognized her car, and she berated my mom in front of all of us. She goes, "I didn't give you that car to chauffeur a bunch of ends around," and she used the full racial slur. And so it was then that I learned about racism. I learned that West Memphis is a racist town, that my grandmother was infected by racism. I've often wondered, if someone there in that swimming pool, some kid didn't go home to a parent who was a police officer or something, and they didn't ask him, "Well, how's your dad at the pool?" And if they didn't say, "Hey, you wouldn't believe what happened. This dude tried to bring a bunch of ends to the pool," right? Well, we showed them. We ran them all.
Instead of going to the swimming pool, Jason and his brothers found places to play closer to home.
Out in the middle of the soybean field, which our trailer park was in, there were these old sheds. They were abandoned. They didn't have any signs on them that said no trespassing or anything like that. And all of the kids had played there for generations, for years. And I don't know how long it takes for a tree to grow, what their lifespan is. I don't really know what kind of tree this was, but it had evidently began its life outside the building. But during its growth, it eventually hit the side of the building and pushed its way into the building and lifted the roof off of the building. And I say building, it was a tin shed,
Yeah.
tin roof, tin shed, and it didn't have a floor. It was a dirt floor. They showed us this. You climb up the tree on one side, and then you're outside, and then you climb down the tree on the inside, right? And then in there greeting you would be sunflowers looking up because they were getting the sun from the roof lifted up. And to us, it was like, Lord of the Rings, a treant. They were holding the roof up, inviting us in. And then inside were these old shells of cars, tore up car frames and stuff. And to us, in our imagination, they became Millennium Falcons, X-Wing TIE fighters, and things like that. And so we played there every day that summer. Every day. We'd swim in the lake, play hide and go seek in the soybean fields, play Star Wars in the shed, And then one day something happened that had never happened before. And the front doors came screeching open, almost like Darth Vader was there. And it was the police, and they rounded up like a dozen of us, just kids ranging ages from 8 to maybe 12. I was 11. My brother Matthew was 9. And took us to the police department and says, "Hey, we need your phone number. We're going to call your parents to come get you. Y'all shouldn't be playing out there. Don't worry, you're not in any trouble. We just want to know, who told you about this place? When did you first start playing? Do you have any brothers or sisters that played there that weren't here today? Any cousins, any other friends?" And so before the end of it, they had ended up arresting every single kid in the trailer park and taking us all to the police station. And eventually, some kids, they pressured in the sand that they had broken things in there when really none of us broke anything in there. If anything had broken anything in there, it was due to negligence and time and the elements, and not us. To us, it was our place, our clubhouse, or it was sacred to us kids, where we went to have fun, until the police were there. And so we ended up getting a public defender, and Mr. Montgomery was ours, my brothers and mine, and my mom would take us there, and he would tell us, he's like, "I can't believe that they're charging you with a crime for this. I'm going to talk to the prosecuting attorney and get charges dropped. Just stay out of there, no trespassing." and we'll make sure the owners put up signs, no trespassing signs. And it seemed fair and reasonable, and that's what we thought was going to happen. And so all of us ended up going to court. Prosecutor Fogelman, he gets up and he says, Your Honor, I think 2 years in the state reform school would do all these kids some good. And Mr. Montgomery stood up and followed that with, Your Honor, I agree.
Wow.
And before the judge could say anything, my mom jumped up and said, Your Honor, my sons aren't going to kids' prison. And the judge said, Ma'am, counsel, come to the bench. And they went up there for what I know now is an ex parte meeting. And when my mom came back, she had that look that mothers get that you can't argue with. That means she's putting her foot down. And when she got to where I was seated, she put down some paperwork. She said, You will sign this. You will not argue with me. And I ended up signing like everybody else did for 5 years probation and a $500 fine.
Wow.
That was $500 for me, $500 for my brother. And then some kids' families had 5 or 6 kids in their families, tragically struck by that. And so for us, our family budget, we only had $100 budget for all 3 of us kids for Christmas. So and for us, that's 10 Christmases gone for my family. If you add my $500, my little brother Matt's $500. And so from that point on, all of us were felons. All of us were troublemakers. All of us were trouble. And so when I started school the next year, we'd just be sitting in class and all of a sudden the intercom would come on and they would say, Send Jason to the principal's office. So I'd have to go to the principal's office and there would be my probation officer, and I'd have to, answer questions, how are you doing in school? How's your homework? I mean, all these things. And so he was very cordial, very professional, and never abused me. But because of this continued action and practice, people outside the trailer park, because the schools didn't just comprise the trailer park was a very small fraction of the population that went to the school. We were actually the poorest fraction. Everybody else lived in the houses and, we're nicely dressed and stuff. And so this burden was even harder, made life even more difficult for us, because now instead of talking to us directly, people are just saying behind our backs, why do those kids always get called to the principal's office? Oh, you didn't know? They're all trouble. They all are on probation or parole and have a probation officer. And so that gave our trailer park this horrible reputation. And then it made it to where we were ostracized even worse than normal.
Wow.
And so we weren't even allowed to associate or be friends with anybody at that point. Anybody outside my trailer park, it was very difficult to be friends with people inside the trailer park. You can't be friends with them if they have a record. Friendship was very difficult, in those years, being able to have a friend legally and being able to have a friend that's worth having.
But despite the prejudices of his community, Jason was still able to form a few friendships with other boys his age.
I was biking home from the store, and on the next street over, there was this kid I'd never seen before on a skateboard. And we struck up a conversation, and he let me ride a skateboard. I let him ride my bike, and we became friends. And he was like, I saw you in study. I'm blind. At the time I didn't have glasses. I can't see that few feet in front of my face. I was like, oh, well, I didn't see you, but here we are now, dude. Hey.
That kid was Damian Eccles.
From when I met Damien there, we became friends. I actually met Jesse on my first day of school in Marion in the 6th grade. And in my homeroom class, did really good, met kids in there, did all right, making friends and stuff. And but at recess, there at the end of the day, it was the whole school instead of just my class. And I'm out there talking to people, still doing okay, cool and everything. And next thing I know, I notice out the corner of my eye, like blurry shape, not that vehicle, moving really fast towards me, right? And out of nowhere, a fist, right, tries to punch me in the face. And so I just duck and move, and then he turns and comes back at me again. So I just take off running. This dude is chasing me all around the playground. He's like a couple of years older, And I hear this voice saying, Jesse, stop. Jesse, get over here. Jesse, promise me you won't try to hit him again. Jesse, give me your word. I said, promise. And he says, I promise I won't try to hit him again. And that's when I met Jesse. I was a new kid and he tried to beat me up.
What?
And this girl kept This girl, Don Spurlock, got him to give his word that he wouldn't try to hit me again. You know?
That's so weird. Okay, so that's how you met Jesse. Meanwhile, when you met
Yeah.
Damien, he's like, "Here's my skateboard. How let's
Yeah.
hang out."
Right. So there's your different compare and contrast. And I would get to know Jesse better. He would later on, a couple of years later, maybe in the 8th or 9th grade, he would move on the same street I lived on for like part of a summer. He lived there, and so I'm like, oh, okay, hey, don't try to hit me. But I didn't say that, but I'm kind of looking at him like, it's right here on my street. You got to try to bully me. I mean, does the promise still stand? And not that we've been around each other, but he was cool and a good neighbor and stuff. We got to know each other, got to know his dad really well. But then he moved back to Highland Trailer Park. When you're a kid at that age, and then you're bound by probation, and you can't really go far from your home. You have to stay close. And so for Damien, he would move to Lakeshore Trailer Park, but he didn't have a record. He wasn't one of the kids that was a few years earlier got swept up for playing hide and go seek out in the shed or whatever. But he still suffered the prejudice. And so he would end up falling in love with this girl, Deanna, who lived in Marion. And her father, once he learned that Damien lived in Lakeshore, he was like, oh, that's where all those bad kids live that have a record. My daughter is not going to date one of those guys. And so he forbade them to see each other. He forbade her to see him. The way he reacted to Deanna wanting to date Damien, who was from that trailer park. So obviously the prejudices had reached him. If Damien would have lived next door to him or on the same street as him and lived in a nice house and had a nice family, he wouldn't have acted that way. If the word hadn't reached his ears that all the kids from that trailer park had a record, he wouldn't have acted that way. He would have said, oh, that's great. Let me meet your parent. And so instead of being a reasonable parent, contacting Damien's mom, Pam, and be like, hey, how can we chaperone our children and provide a healthy and safe environment for them to, know one another and things like that? How can we work together on this? He decided that he would try to destroy Damien and even destroy his daughter if that's what it took. He would ground her, and it got to the point where not only was she not allowed to go to Damien's house, but Damien wasn't allowed to come over there. And once he found out that at school that they were still able to see each other between classes and that Damien was carrying her books for her to class, he contacted the principal and made sure the principal had communications with the school teachers to where if they saw Damien and Deanna together, they would physically split them apart, like get in between them and like, no, y'all can't be around each other or you're going to detention. So Damien, he's going to detention. And so Damien and Deanna being, two teenagers in love and seemingly the whole world against them being together, the only solution they could come up with was to run away. And so after school, instead of going home, they decided to go to California to make their dreams come true. And so they invited me to go.
The story of Jason's youth sounds like a Mark Twain novel, a story of good-hearted boys up against a world ready to paint their play as mischief, with the kind of wandering plot where one misadventure follows another, twisting like a creek through the countryside. It's not the kind of story where you expect to find the mutilated bodies of children or accusations of satanic rape and murder. It never is. While Damien and his girlfriend Deanna were fighting to stay together in spite of her father's biases, Jason was dealing with his own emotional upheaval when his birth father came back into his life.
He and my mother just divorced when I was 4, and then after I was 5, my stepfather, came in the picture. But somewhere along the way, there was this unwritten rule where there is no real dad. You call your stepdad dad, and that's your dad, even though he doesn't have the same last name. And even though I have very strong memories of living with my father, and I see him in these memories, I know he's there. The guy that I remember when I have these vivid memories. I'm sitting on this floor in this kitchen and I'm leaning. I know it's against my mom's legs, but I've got this giant bowl of cake batter, right? It's not full, but it's like
Sure.
I got it everywhere. And in front of me, I can see sitting at the kitchen table, this man with this big old beard, and he's holding this little baby. And I know that's my dad. And that's all there is to that memory. But I see him, you know. And then there's another memory where I'm sitting at a coffee table in front of the TV, and there's this tomato cut really weird looking with this gunk in it, right? And there's another one next to it, and there's that same man taking a bite saying, eat it. It's good, see? And it was tuna salad that my mom had made, putting the tomato with it. I was like, I'm not eating that. And he was like, oh, it's good, you know. I remember that. You know, that's a memory I have. You know, I can't lose it. I don't remember anything before it or after it, but I remember that. One day, you know, just out the blue, I was coming home from the store, and there was this vehicle in the drive that was unrecognizable. I'd never seen before. And so I walked in, and there in the living room was my dad. When I saw him, I knew that's who he was. I knew that was my father, even though we've not spoken about him at that point, you know, over a decade. I've not seen a photo of him. You know, I've been calling another man my dad as long as I can remember at that point, you know, since I was 5 years old. And so at that point, my mom's like, oh, I'm out of cigarettes. And she goes, Larry, would you take me to the store? And I'm like, I'm going to ride with y'all to the store. Even though I just got back from the store, right? And so I get in the back and we go to the store, and my mom gets out and goes in, and he turns around and goes, what? You know who I am? I say, yeah, you're my dad. I see this look, you know, like I knew he wouldn't forget me in his face, you know, and he just kind of nodded. And my mom comes back into the vehicle, and he tells her, he's like, he knows who I am. And she immediately goes into hysterics and starts slapping him and telling him, you promised you wouldn't tell him, you know, and then he's like, I didn't tell him. And I'm like, Mom, I remember him. I know it's mad. She goes, you can't effing say that. Don't effing lie to me. You don't remember. You can't remember. Like I do remember, you know. And so my dad would invite me and my brother, you know, to come visit, you know, for Christmas and get to know his side of the family and to meet his parents, those other grandparents that I don't remember, you know, that I don't know, and to meet his brothers, meet his sister and their kids and everything. And so my brother and I, we go out to Sheridan, Arkansas, in the middle of Arkansas, south of Little Rock. And we're no longer on the edge of Arkansas. We're going way out in the middle of Arkansas now. And I meet all these people. I meet my grandparents. I meet my uncles and aunts and stuff. And it's Christmas time. I meet my cousin, and it's so wonderful and it's great. And there's just so much love and warmth. And so when I go home, and on the way home, my dad, he's like, hey, you're a teenager now. What would you say about coming and living with me until you graduate high school? We'll get you a job at the store, you know, get you a vehicle, you know, and go to school out here and everything, you know, talk to your mom about it. And so when I got home, you know, and it's still a Christmas holiday, you know, and I talked to my mom about it, her reaction was, oh, you don't love me. You hate me. And she has a nervous breakdown, and she would attempt suicide and would slit her wrists or you know, her neck, you know, her elbows and stuff. And so I would find her and call 911 and stuff. And so when Damien asked me to run away with him and Deanna, I couldn't, because I can't imagine what my mom, how she would react, you know. And so I couldn't go with them. And I couldn't give him any advice that would help him stay there still and be with Deanna too. And so he would run away, and they would, of course, you know, get caught. And he would go to get locked up, and I would learn later, in a mental institution. He would go to kids' prison, where they tried to send me, which is, you know, juvenile hall and everything. And he went through hell. He already, you know, suffers mental trauma, and he has to be medicated and has to be counseled. And this had to be done with care. And so now he's in a situation where he's ripped away from the person he loves, and he's feeling the injustice of that, and he's put in a place and where he's deprived of his medication, and where he's basically, you know, tortured. And the people there who are supposed to be counseling him aren't counseling him. They're antagonizing him, you know, and patronizing him, and just making things worse for him and not giving him the medication. And so then they would use that, you know, record later, you know, when we would go on trial for a crime we didn't commit, to to try to give him the death penalty and succeed in doing that. And so all that stems from the prejudice of West Memphis. You asked what was growing up in West Memphis and Marion like, and that's what it was like.
The prejudices of West Memphis were already strong enough to keep two young people in love apart, but they would only get more vicious after the bodies of 3 8-year-old boys, Stephen Branch, Christopher Byers, and Michael Moore, were found mutilated in a creek bed.
The murders happened on May the 5th. I found out about them on Thursday, May the 6th. They, of course, I learned about it at school, on the news, because each of the classrooms had a TV in the room, for like programming or news events. And, I was in Coach Baca's class, and teacher came to the door and was like, hey, you need to go turn news on. And that's when they were showing, that the boys had just been found and everything. So it was pretty traumatic and everything. And at that point, my mom, made us, me and my little brothers, stay at home until they find who did these murders. They put out, on the news that after that point, do you know anything about, what was done, this crime or anything? There's a reward.
Not long after the murders, rumors started to circulate about Damien.
Damien's probation officer, he had one at this point from running away with Deanna. And I mentioned how Damien was antagonized and not treated with care when he was arrested and denied medication. And because of that, he didn't react well to them. And he didn't react well to being on probation either. He was like, I'm being treated unjustly. I'm being treated wrong. So F this probation officer, F that guy. I don't want to be talked to every week. I don't want to go to this guy's, office every week and talk to him and have him question all of my choices all the time. So he had a combative, antagonistic attitude. And so that bled over into his probation officer. He had the same attitude back. I didn't have that type of experience with my probation officer. Even though I had to talk to him all the time, I didn't blame him for it. He's just doing his job. And, yes, I have to answer a million questions, but if my mom asked me a million questions, I got to answer those too. So it's just part of being a kid and then being part of being wrongfully convicted, and in a sense, you got to follow the rules and do what they tell you. And so because of that, his probation officer had a deep hatred towards him and a deep hatred towards everything about it. And so he was the one that said Damien must have done this. And so he started this whole rumor mill that Damien is part of a satanic cult and that the only person who could have committed this crime was a satanic cult. And so he would go around the entire city of West Memphis and around the entire city of Marion showing people photos of Damien and saying, have you seen this cult leader around in your neighborhood? Have you heard of a satanic cult being out here? Did you know that we think that those boys were murdered by a satanic cult? And he just kept saying this and kept asking people this. And so people would say, hey, man, you wouldn't believe what the police just asked me as they talked to one another. And so that created the whole rumor of Satanism being the cause of the murders. And so that's how we were scapegoated.
What did you think when the rumor mill got around to you that these murders were a result of Satanism? And did you immediately hear Damien's name associated with it? And if so, what did you think?
Well, when I heard it, it was actually from the police, and they were questioning Damien, right? And it was in front of my house, and they were like, do you think there was a cult in there? Do you think these crimes could have been occult related? And at the time, Damien thought he was a religious knowledge guru. He loved to read about religion and all types of religion. So he thought this could be a career opportunity for me to advise the police, because he didn't know who committed the crime, but the police were telling him that it was satanic. So he offered any information that he knew about Satanism and cultism and things like that, not realizing that they were targeting him to be the scapegoat and anybody around him. And the way that the police operate is they will target people around you and lie to them and lie to you to the point and tell you that they have all the evidence in the world against you in order to make you lie against the person they want to, make fall for the crime.
Yeah. So that's actually really interesting that the police were coming around to people's houses, coming around to the trailer parks, asking people about cults and Satanism. And then they called Damien in, and Damien, who's doing a bunch of reading about different like religious practices, is like, oh, I can tell you about cults. And then they like turn that into, see,
Yeah.
he's a cult leader. Had you ever heard of the Satanic Panic before all of this had happened? I know you were so young.
No, and I didn't watch the news and things like that. Only things that were forced upon me by school. But I was a kid, and then had my own problems, to face and my own life to live, and I wasn't as world wise as I grew up to be now.
Yeah.
No, I had not heard of the Satanic Panic at that point. No, I had been wrongfully convicted in a sense at the age of 11. Even though at that point I was still kind of blame myself because I'm like, I was there playing hide and go seek. So in essence, I felt guilt for it, even though I didn't really felt like I deserved the punishment because there wasn't any, no trespassing sign. And I didn't break anything, and I never saw anybody break anything in there either.
The police investigation linked Damien to Jessie Miss Kelly through deeply dubious information by a neighbor who claimed the three had gone to a witches' meeting together, a statement she later said she'd made up in part because of police pressure. Jessie, who had a reported IQ of 72, was brought in for questioning, and after 12 hours of interrogation, only 46 minutes of which were recorded, and all without a parent or lawyer, Jessie was coerced into a false confession which implicated Damien and Jason. Though his supposed confession was riddled with inconsistencies, and though he soon recanted, the police arrested all three teenagers for the murders.
The night I was arrested and when I was questioned, by police detectives, they weren't receptive to the truth. They had a fictitious story they wanted to stick to, and their work was to break my will to accept their story. That's the only thing that they wanted to do. They didn't want the truth. And no matter how many times I told them the truth, about where I was at the day of the murders, what my life was like, who I was and things, they absolutely refused it. And so years later, I would hear, testimony from several of my neighbors, what life was like after I was arrested and the torture they were put under by the police department, by the media, and the suspicion they lived under. They would be just kids pulled out of their homes and questioned, and not questioned in a way to where the questioners are, being accepting of answers. The questions are put in an accusatory tones, like, were you a member of the cult too?
Yeah.
You might want to make a deal now, or you could suffer the same fate. Exactly, just like with Damien when we were being questioned outside my house. We don't know who committed the crime or anything about it. We just only know what we're being told as well. And what you're being told is stuff that people imagine because they don't have the facts. These are just the worst case scenarios that they can imagine. And in the absence of fact, their imaginations are given the weight of fact. And that's dangerous. And in a sense, it's like trying to speak to my mother when she isn't well, when she's suffering from a mental breakdown. It's like trying to reason with the unreasonable. You're doing it from a position that's powerless. As a child and then as a defendant, as a kid being accused of a crime, you have no position to argue with anybody, no way to make them see the facts for what they are. You can only put them out there and hope they'll take them and look at them, but they don't. I still felt like even though I'd been arrested for a crime I didn't commit, even then I still had hope that since we were actually going to trial that, we would be found not guilty. The state would pursue facts over fiction. But I should have realized, that what was shown to me the night of my arrest, the way they were questioning me and the way they refused the truth, that's how the whole trial would be. And that's how everything leading up to the trial would be. Instead of everything being based on fact, it would be based on lies.
Ana Vasquez of the San Antonio Four had the very same naive belief. So did I, despite facing that very same attitude during questioning, a refusal by authorities to accept the simple and true answers I gave them. There's no way anyone will believe this ludicrous story. Everything will get cleared up at trial. Again and again, I hear that from my friends who've been wrongly convicted. If your only experience of the criminal legal process is television, you think the courtroom is like a laboratory where all the accusation and suspicion gets boiled down to truth beyond a reasonable doubt. But the courtroom isn't a laboratory. It's a battleground of storytelling, where the most compelling story, and not necessarily the most truthful, wins.
Jesse Misskelley was tried separately from the other two and was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. Jason and Damien went to trial together. From the start, the biases of West Memphis were on full display.
Without knowledge, you have a vacuum, and it's an empty space in you that seeks knowledge, right? You want to fill it with the answer to the questions you have. And the media serves that purpose for the public, but the media has that same quest for knowledge. What are the facts? And a lot of defense attorneys are trained to tell their clients, do not speak to the media, right? And so in this vacuum, this need for knowledge, they're wanting this information, and the only people that will give them information is the state. And so the state, just like the police that works for the state, the prosecutors, they can lie to you during the course of an investigation. They can lie to the media about you during the course of an investigation. They don't have to give the facts. And when the police do this, and the media run with it and put it on TV and the radio and in print for their viewers, we all absorb this information thinking it must be true, it must be factual, it must be accurate. We never question. We're not trained to question it. We're trained to believe that the police and the state are there to protect us and to serve us and to serve the interests of justice and to find the truth. We're never told that the Supreme Court gives them permission to lie to any of us about a crime. They will lie about us, and they can do so with impunity and immunity and no punishment whatsoever. And because of that, the deck is stacked against innocent people who find themselves under the crosshairs of the justice system. My attorney, he pulled me to the side and whispered in my ear, and he says, remember the judge's orders. No matter what you hear, no matter what you say, you cannot react to it. You are to remain stoic and quiet. You will get your chance to address that. And so here's comes Michael Carson and tells these lies that I had told him in the county jail that I had done these crimes when I never told him. I'd never heard of Michael Carson until he was walking in the courtroom.
Michael Carson was another teenager who was in the county jail at the same time as Jason. He testified at trial that Jason had confessed to him that he had taken part in the murders. False testimony from jailhouse informants, by the way, is one of the leading causes of wrongful convictions.
And we weren't even allowed to question why he was in the county jail. We weren't allowed to question him because he wasn't the one on trial. He was protected by the state. And I, the innocent person, Damien, the innocent person, Jesse, the innocent person, were not protected. We were victimized over and over again. Even the whole satanic thing, what was lies. They mentioned he has 12 black T-shirts in his closet, is what Fogelman said. Yes, I had 12 black T-shirts, but I also had other colored T-shirts and button-up shirts and different things. I had a gray Journey T-shirt of the Escape album with the red half sleeves. I had a white Motley Crue Dr. Feelgood T-shirt. I had a white Ozzy Osbourne T-shirt. I had all different types of colored T-shirts, besides black, but he only said black to prejudice. It wasn't a whole truth because he wasn't interested in presenting the truth to the jury, only half-truths and lies in order to enable them to convict us not on fact, but on their prejudices.
Of course, it wouldn't matter if all Jason ever wore was black clothing. His taste in clothes, like his love for heavy metal music, was completely irrelevant to the question of whether or not he committed murder. But when your character is assassinated in the courtroom and in the media, you're forced to waste time justifying small details like these about your life and personality, anything that makes you different from the people around you.
And for the prosecution, bringing up these details seemed to work. The jury in Jason and Damien's trial wasn't inclined to be sympathetic to them.
They weren't a juror of our peers, as they say. First of all, since this was a death penalty case, the jurors had to be what's called death penalty qualified. And so anybody who's my peer would not be allowed to be a jury. Anybody who doesn't believe in the death penalty would not be allowed to be a juror in my case. And the people who are skeptical of the death penalty are usually the people who understand that the police can lie to a person in an investigation. The people who believe in the death penalty are usually people who believe that the police are not empowered to lie, who will be honest. And so therefore, in a trial, when you have a fact being contested by two different people, and one is a police officer, a death penalty qualified juror is going to believe the police officer and not you. And so that's prejudicial. And so we never had a chance. And then my public defenders, Paul Ford and Robin Wiley, I don't know if they ever actually believed in my innocence or believed that Damien was innocent, because they kept on, well, what about this? And they would bring up the record, Damien's, mental health record and things like that, his anguish during that, as if that was evidence of guilt for the crime, and as if that was evidence of cultism, and that that was evidence of me being involved with it, and so it was very frustrating to give the truthful answers of questions, but still see those answers being received not with belief, but with skepticism. My public defender, every day I would ask him, when do I get to testify? When do my witnesses get to testify? And he was like, not today. And he would just blow me off, but at that point I'm being pulled away by the guards back to the jail, out of the courtroom. So I'm not able to communicate really with him. And when I question him, I'm just a kid at that point. I've never really been allowed to question adults. I've never been allowed to exert my will against an adult, And so when an adult puts her foot down and is like, that's the last word, you have to obey it. And so it's a very disadvantaged position to be in when you're a kid and an innocent kid, and the people who are supposed to be protecting you aren't. There it was. My whole trial was ended, and I was never given an opportunity to testify. My witnesses were never given an opportunity to testify.
Jason was sentenced to life in prison, while Damien was sentenced to death.
But meanwhile, one of the most important developments in the case of the West Memphis Three was underway. During the trial, filmmakers Joe Berlinger and Bruce Sinofsky had begun filming a documentary about the case. That movie was called Paradise Lost. They went down to Arkansas thinking they were making a film about three depraved teens who'd committed horrible murders. But in the course of filming the trials, they came to the conclusion that they were documenting a tremendous miscarriage of justice.
There's this woman in Los Angeles, Kathy Bakken, and she has the coolest job in the world. She gets movies before everybody and gets to watch them. That's her job, right? And then she, right? Like, how you're waiting on a movie to come out, you see an advertisement, and you're like, oh, in 2 weeks it's in theaters, and you got to wait. She's already seen it a long time ago, because she gets the movies and she makes the cool poster art. She makes the movie art, that you see at the movie theaters, that you see, on the display, advertising it. So she gets Paradise Lost as part of her job, and she watches all types of movies, even ones that she doesn't like. It's part of her job, but, she gets watch ones she does too. And so when she watches it, she's like, oh my God, she's horrified, that we were railroaded in such a way. So she shows the movie to all of her friends, to Burke Sauls, to Grove Pashley, to Lisa Fancher. And they write Damien, they write Jesse, and they write me. They're like, oh my God, and so we write them back. They're like, hey, can we come visit you? I'm like, yes, please. And so they come to Arkansas and they go to Dan Stidham's office, and he was Jesse Miss Kelly's trial attorney. And they're in there talking to him about the case, before visiting us. And they're like, what's being done legally? And he tells them, he says, listen, the truth is this. If the people in this room right here, right now, don't do something, no one will.
That small group of people would go on to make the website wm3.org, which became an essential source of information about the case.
When the documentaries came out, people all over the world saw, what we went through and started writing us and getting on the message boards and started calling, for justice and help and everything. And that's when things started to change. That's when they started raising money to hire attorneys to represent us post-conviction, started paying for DNA testing to get done, or to hire attorneys first that just argued that we would be allowed to get the DNA testing because the state fought us every step of the way, to hire investigators to do investigations. And so that's when people started supporting us. And, the theme was usually the same. Hey, I was just like you as a kid. I listened to heavy metal music, rock t-shirt, incredible mullet, stuff like that. That's when the support started, and that's what gave us hope.
Support for the West Memphis Three grew exponentially, with celebrities like Eddie Vedder, Johnny Depp, and the Dixie Chicks joining the cause. Finally, in 2010, the Arkansas Supreme Court ordered a new evidentiary hearing for the West Memphis Three. Their attorneys were preparing for a new trial. If they won, the state would potentially have to pay the three of them millions for their wrongful convictions. But before they went to trial, Jason's attorney came to him with another option.
It was a Wednesday, August the 10th, and they said, Baldwin, go back out into the hallway. Just as I was walking in, they need you at the control center. You have an attorney visit. And all the times I've had an attorney visit, I know well in advance. So this one was an unannounced one, which told me something was up, even though I knew at this point we had an evidentiary hearing set for December the 22nd. In front of Judge Lacer, there's things going on in the case, investigations happening and things like that. A lot of communications behind the scenes with the state's attorneys and our attorneys trying to get things agreed upon as far as testing and stuff like that, rather than fighting, in front of the court and litigating and everything. And so I go and get strip searched and all that stuff, before going up front to the shift briefing room where they would have the attorney visit. And as soon as I walked in, there's Blake, my Arkansas counsel. He's like, Jason, what would you say if I told you you could go home tomorrow? I said, I hear a big butt in there. He's like, yes, let me tell you about the Alford plea. I was like, oh, I know about the Alford plea. He was like, I have to explain it, as part of my requirements as your attorney. I have to legally explain every offer of the state and everything. And so he had everything printed out and we walked through it and everything.
In an Alford plea, defendants can plead guilty while still claiming to be innocent. It allows them to walk free, but it also allows the state to maintain its conviction record without having to admit fault for a wrongful conviction. Frankly, and I don't say this lightly, it's fucked up. The state only offers an Alford plea when they know they've convicted an innocent person. Why else would they be fine with that person walking free from a life sentence? And if the innocent person takes the bargain, and it's hard to resist freedom after decades in prison for a crime you didn't commit, then prosecutors will never face accountability for their actions, and the state won't have to pay compensation for wrongful imprisonment.
And I was like, no way in the world will I sign that. Never, ever. And gave me a hug. He's like, I'm proud of you. I was hoping that's would be your response, because we had everything on our side. We finally had DNA testing happening, even though the state didn't agree to test everything we wanted. They did agree to test some things, and those things showed that we were not who was giving that DNA, who was there at the crime and stuff, who committed the crime. And so I was very hopeful for the upcoming evidentiary hearing. I was hopeful for a trial. I had a very dear friend at the time. I called her that night and everything. And of course, she had been talking to Damien's wife, Lori, and everything. Of course, everything was a buzz and stuff because of the case. And I was like, hey, they offered me an Alford plea today. We'll talk about it, Saturday when you come visit, because she was going to come visit me that Saturday. And she was like, awesome, I'm glad you said no, Of course, she didn't know anything about alpha plea. She just knew plea, but she knew I was looking forward to the trial and everything, and finally proving our innocence and, getting the honor of our names back and going home. And so this was like mental torture. Saturday happens, you have a different set of clothes that you wear for visits. They don't want people to see you in your normal rags, right? And so I get my visitation, which is against the rules for you to put on your visitation clothes if you don't have a visit scheduled, and you have to get them scheduled ahead of time, like whoever wants some visits. So you have to be on your visitor's list. They have to call and make an appointment to visit you, and then there has to be an opening for that visitation day, because it's of limited spaces and stuff. And so I had one scheduled. And so visitation is from noon to 4, but they have a 1:00 count time, right? And when they do count, they lock the prison down about 20 minutes or so before count time to start getting ready for the count time. So if you have a visit, you always want your visitor to get there early enough to where you can get called out and they can get processed, and the guards can call you out of the barracks or from work or wherever you're at, and you can get there in time before that 1:00 count starts. In essence, you want to be called around 12, 12:15 or 12:30, because after 12:30, you might not be called until after count is cleared. And because visitation is going on and because people aren't in their normal areas, they tend to mess up count a lot on visitation days. And so the count, instead of being 10 or 15 minutes and then they unlock the place down, might be 30, 45, an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours. And sometimes for the lucky people who got out on visitation, they might say emergency count, everybody head back to the barracks, for a recount, and so that's what you definitely don't want, because then they won't restart visitation back up, and you just missed your visit. And so I'm sitting there right in the day room. I got my visitation clothes. I'm looking at the television. I'm in front of the door. I'm by the call box waiting on my name because, I got a visit coming up, and so 12 o'clock rolls around, the earliest possible time they'll call. They start calling people, names and stuff. People start going to visits, not me. And then 12:30 rolls around. I'm sitting there looking at the clock. And so, you're thinking, at this point, I've done 18 years. What's time, right? What's time, right? But it's in those minutes. Those are the minutes that drag on longer than any other minute in the world, right? Is when you're waiting on something good and you're looking at the clock, right? And so sure enough, they holler in the intercom, everybody catch your rat, count time. Oh man, I didn't beat the count. I hope, they do it quick and get it done quickly, and so everybody catches your rack. They do count time. I'm sitting on my rack, and so I go back up there after count. I'm waiting at the day room. And so about 1:00, they clear the count and start calling visitors again. If they don't call me, I'm like, oh, wow, she must be late, which she's never late. And so I'm sitting there, and all of a sudden, about 2:30, getting close to 3 o'clock, I'm starting to imagine things now, right? Like, what if she had an accident, on the way here? What if she got a flat tire? What if they're giving her a problem at the gate because of something she's wearing, and now they're in a verbal match up there or something? Because I could, that stuff like that happens, So any scenario without any fact, my mind is racing. I'm just imagining things, right? At that point in time, it's like, it's ticking, and so finally they say, Baldwin. I'm like, yes, I'm getting my visit. They say, go to the chaplain's office, and they only call you to the chaplain's office for one thing, and that's when someone has died. And so there I am, waiting on this visit, worrying now because the visit, I haven't been called to the visit, and now I'm being called to the chaplain's. Now my worst fears seem to be coming true, right? And so I can't run down the hallway. That's against the rules. And so I'm like, I'm in 12 barracks, right? I got to get all the way down past the control center, right? 12 barracks. There's a crash gate at every 2 barracks, right? I got to stop at this crash gate. And at every crash gate, there's other people. And I'm still wearing my visitation clothes. I haven't even changed out. I'm going down the hallway. I can't run. And everybody that sees me, they're like, Baldwin, you're going to visit, man. Glad you got a visit, man. Have a good one. And every time someone says that, it's like a knife in my heart because that's where I should be going. But that's not where I'm going. I'm going to the chaplain's office where I'm about to get the worst news in the world. And so every crash gate, everybody that stops me is well wishing me, I'm glad to see me, but it's not what's happening. I'm going to something else. And so I get there and the chaplain hands me the phone. I'm expecting something terrible. And I get the phone and it's Holly, who I was supposed to get the visit. And I'm just like, at this point, I'm like crying. My heart is beating. I'm so relieved that she's not dead. And I'm like, what is going on? And she's like, I'm sorry I couldn't come visit you. I'm with Lori. She's been up all night with Damien. He's scared that he's going to die. If we don't get this Alfred plea, he's scared that they're going to kill him, even though all this stuff. And at this point, I'm so relieved that she's alive. That the idea of anybody dying at this point, no matter what the possibility is, I can't take it. And so I call Blake immediately, I'm like, tell him I'm going to take the Alfred plea, and so that's how that happened.
If not for Damien facing the death penalty, Jason would have refused the Alfred plea on principle until he had a chance to prove his innocence in court and force the state to acknowledge fault.
That deal with the devil saved Damien's life, but it meant that all three men, though released, were still formally convicted of murder. Despite the injustice of their legal situation, they've managed to build lives for themselves after prison. Jason co-founded an organization called Proclaim Justice that works to exonerate innocent people. And he still loves Metallica as much as he did as a teenager. The band became supporters of the West Memphis Three after learning about how their music was used against the boys in court.
Well, after I got out, they invited me to San Francisco to their 30th year anniversary. They were at the Fillmore. They had 4 nights of shows. And so after that, Lars was like, dude, any show we have anywhere, you're welcome if you can get there. I just have to get there. It's not like he's going to fly me to all the shows. That would be too expensive and crazy. But if I can get there, I got a seat, and I can bring friends. I took Daniel. We went to see Metallica in El Paso.
Daniel Villegas was the defendant at the center of a wrongful conviction case that Proclaim Justice took on. Thanks to Jason and his organization, Daniel was acquitted after over 2 decades in prison.
I went behind the scenes and met Lars and them, and he got to hang out with Lars, Daniel Villegas, and he's a Metallica fan, and so to be able to share that with somebody and to know that this kid suffered what I went through, and now here he is kicking it and hanging out with Metallica, and we're all just jamming out. And so Beto O'Rourke there too, and so just to do that, that's fun.
Jason is also friends with Ana Vazquez, our guest from last episode.
Since I've been here in Texas and Austin, she invited me down to her ranch and hang out with her and her wife, Denise, and some of their friends. And honestly, we didn't talk about cases and things like that too much because we were putting together Anna's wife, Denise, coupons. And then she had some friends whose wives coupon. And so they have the storage shed full of stuff that they coupon. And so they would put them together in little packages, right? And so I don't coupon or shop. That's beyond me. But that's their superpower. But they would then hand the stuff off to me and another of her friends, and we would drive into Austin and give out, stuff to homeless people, and things like that. And so we would do, this is pre-COVID, we would do this, a couple of times a month, on the weekend and stuff. And then we would sit outside in her yard, around the fire, eating good food that, Denise barbecued and stuff like that. I'll never forget the first time I went over there. Denise's mom was staying with them, and before I walked in, they're like, "Hang on, can't go in yet." And Anna yelled in the house. She goes, "Man in the house! Man in the house!" Because Denise's mom was in there, and apparently they would say this. This was a phrase they brought from their time in prison for when a male guard would walk into the barracks, because they grew up in an open barracks of women. And so they had female guards and men guards, but when men guards would come into the barracks, somebody would yell that to let people know you got a guy coming in here, and so they carried that tradition home with them. And to warn their mom that they were bringing a guy in, they yelled at us. So I just found that so, I don't know, endearing and just funny and just real.
I'm curious to, because you're such a like positive guy and you're such a sweet guy. I mean, I know that because I've met you. And I wonder if you struggle in the same way with me, where it's like on any given day, I feel like I'm doing good work. I've turned this horrible thing that happened to me into something that gives me purpose. But also, like, there are days where I just remember a horrible moment and it's crushing to me. And as much as you can make this a part of you in a positive way, are there things that you struggle to sort of translate that way? Is there anything that just hurts when you think back on it?
There's a lot that hurts, a lot of it hurts. And just because, I react to things in the most positive way possible, the whole world isn't like that. And not everybody's been able to turn the situation into a positive. It's like I didn't run away with Damien because I didn't want to cause harm to my family, because I knew that my mom would not respond to that in a healthy way, just like she didn't respond to my dad's request that I go live with him until I turned 18 in a healthy way. And so she didn't respond to me being in prison in a healthy way, and she still had my two younger brothers to care for. And so those things like that were beyond my control are the things that hurt the most. And even though while inside and in prison, I tried to be the best positive role model for them that I could. I got my GED in there. I applied myself and worked above and beyond what was called for in the terms of my condemnation to serve a lifetime of hard labor. I served every day in hard labor, but I went above and beyond that. And because of that, I would win the respect of everybody in the administration, would give them trust, with great jobs that required more than hard labor from me, that required, me to apply myself in jobs that was in a caring way to help heal people. I was able to help people get their education. I was able to counsel people. And all of this was to show my brothers, like, yes, we've gone through hell, but you know what? You can pick yourself up and do good with it. But they had a totally different attitude to me. They're young teenagers growing up under the shadow of their older brother getting arrested. And to them, are like, my mom couldn't tell them anything at that point. Like, oh, Jason always did what you told him to do. He always did right. Look what happened to him. So F the world, And so to witness that, to witness my brothers go through that and to live that lifestyle and to make those life decisions causes a lot of pain to this day, So yeah, you live with things that you can change and you live with the things you can't change. You do your best and hope for the best.
Yeah. Yeah, that's real. I definitely feel that too, because I'm also an older sibling, and my younger sisters were definitely impacted by this and have had their own struggles that they still deal with to this day. So that's a really difficult part, and it's not something that's your fault or my fault, but also you can't take it back.
Right.
Like you can't make it better for them. We've spent a long time talking. Do you have any final thoughts?
Right. Yeah. Satanic panic, prejudice. Those are all, things that we must protect our hearts against, like racism. Those things are infectious, I believe, like paranoia, any type of negative mentality, a social construct. They tend to, spread, through people, and things like that. Just protect your heart. We all must protect our hearts against prejudice. Against fear of the other, against fear of the unknown, and against just dislike of people's personal choices, and lifestyles, Just because someone has a different lifestyle or set of beliefs than yours doesn't mean it's wrong, and doesn't mean that you're going to be forced into that lifestyle or beliefs. It just means that they're free to exercise their liberties in the best way that they see fit. And I just ask that people respect that. And not try to think that, oh, that person's living that way, I'm going to be forced to live that way. No, just let people live their lives freely. And then when it comes to crimes and things like that, it's a very difficult paradigm shift to look at the news, and when they say suspect, to not think, oh, well, that's the person who committed that crime. For the justice system to work, there must be what's called, the benefit of the doubt, the preponderance of the evidence. So to deny that denies an integral ingredient for justice's work. It's like trying to bake bread without yeast. It's not going to rise. It's just going to be a cracker. It's going to be unleavened. It's not going to be bread. You're not going to get what you're trying to get without that integral ingredient, without the presumption of innocence. And so if we start out the gate on every single accusation denying the presumption of innocence, just assuming that person was guilty, assuming that the right person was being charged with the crime, then we've already failed.
Thank you very much for listening to this old school episode from the archives. I publish my favorites twice a month on this feed. And please subscribe at amandaknox.substack.com to get ad-free episodes of Hard Knocks, subscriber-only essays, live video hangouts, and more. Subscribers can also submit questions for my weekly Ask Amanda Anything episodes. Truly, you can ask me anything. Again, that's amandaknox.substack.com. Hope to see you there.